Hey everybody, and welcome to Lesson 2. Our objective in this lesson is to be able to use the Soapstone acronym to help us analyze an argument in light of its rhetorical situation. Well, if that is indeed our objective, we probably better be posing the question, what indeed is a rhetorical situation? And then how does this mysterious thing help us to analyze a text that we are working with? So let's go ahead, let's break it down even further. Let's simply start with one of our core pieces of terminology for this unit, rhetoric. Now, rhetoric is one of those words that no doubt you have heard before in lots of different contexts and probably with lots of different connotations. If you have heard it in relation to an English class, you're probably thinking in terms of very persuasive text. If maybe you've heard it on the evening news or in relation to politicians, it may even have more of like a swarmy sort of connotation of people that are trying to manipulate or fool you in some way. So it's one of those words for which there's a pretty long backstory. And one of the best ways to kind of come back around to this definition is to actually try to understand that history. So we're going to listen together to a very brief history of rhetoric as told by the team at the Purdue Online Writing Lab in one of their vidcasts. Listen in.
Confused about all this rhetoric business? This vidcast features a conversation between students as they discover and overview the history of rhetoric, answering the important question, what is rhetoric and where did it come from? As you listen, try to make connections between the history of rhetoric and the many rhetorical terms like logos, ethos, and pathos you've likely already heard in your English composition class. An understanding of where terms come from helps us think more critically about their use today. Enjoy the vidcast.
When I think of rhetoric, I think of it primarily as an awareness of the language choices that we make.
Yeah, I guess I think of it that way too. But there's a history to rhetoric as well. I mean, isn't it almost impossible to talk about rhetoric without talking about that history?
Yeah, I think you're right. When most people think of rhetoric, they think about politicians using language just to get what they want. But there is a long history to rhetoric that is really important.
Yeah. Rhetoric, as we know it, first came out of a Greek tradition of preparing speeches. Greek elders who were experts in rhetoric would teach young, wealthy Greek boys specific rhetorical tools that the boys would then practice.
They would memorize long speeches using these rhetorical tools.
Right. And this went on for a long time. But the problem was, not everybody was allowed to do this.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there was a belief that only certain classes of people were qualified to participate in these activities, but that changed when the Sophists came along.
Yeah, who were the Sophists again?
The Sophists believed that they could teach anybody to use rhetoric for the right amount of cash. They thought that anybody could use rhetorical strategies to be an effective speaker.
Yeah, but not everybody was very happy with the Sophists about that. In fact, some people thought that they were ruining this ancient art called rhetoric.
They did believe that, and that's part of the reason that rhetoric came to be seen as negative. People thought that if everybody learned how to use rhetoric, strategies would become meaningless and empty. And then, people wouldn't be concerned with the morality or the truth of their arguments.
Fortunately, though, that's not what happened. Instead, as we moved from more oral to written traditions, we found that we could apply these rhetorical strategies to our writing to make it more effective.
But here's where I don't get it. I understand the history, but how does an understanding of these strategies make writing more effective?
Well, if you think about writing as a process of making an argument, this might make more sense. I don't mean argument in the negative sense of the word, but more as argument as persuasion.
So rhetoric then is using the available means of persuasion to make an argument.
Well, I get it. So I use these rhetorical strategies to shape my writing. Now I understand why instructors talk so much about terms like audience, ethos, pathos, logos, and others when they talk about rhetoric. These are all tools we use to make our arguments more effective.
Exactly. So like I said earlier, rhetoric is about using language in the most effective way. Applying rhetorical strategies helps you make choices in your writing so that you know how best to use language to make your point.
Awesome. What a great overview to sort of help us understand where we come to this definition of rhetoric and how it applies to what we're doing. All right, so let's pop our slideshow back on and catch up to where we left off. All right, so then if rhetorical analysis is the process of assessing how something persuades or positions us as readers, viewers, and listeners, then it makes sense why this is such an important skill. We know that this is the process of essentially opening up our eyes to how different voices around the world are constantly seeking to enlist our support or shape our behavior. If we know that everything is trying to have some sort of impact upon us, that larger awareness helps us to really sort of sift out what are the things that deserve our attention, which of these things are trustworthy, and where do I want to put my energy. All right, now if we look back at lesson 1, our focus was on 2 strategies, the strategies of close reading and annotation. We used these 2 strategies to critically engage with a text and break it down for deeper meaning. Now, in the next step, what we're going to do is we're going to deepen our knowledge of a text by examining it through the lens of its own unique rhetorical situation. Well, then what's a rhetorical situation? That's really just a fancy phrase to describe the larger context or set of circumstances within which a writer or speaker communicates. And there's always a rhetorical situation for any text, right? Nothing is created in a vacuum. Nothing comes from nothing. So we're asking ourselves essentially, what is the writer or the speaker trying to communicate? Why are they trying to communicate, and to whom are they trying to communicate? Now, in the case of historical texts, like the speeches that we'll be reading in this unit, we need to accept right from the very beginning that we, our 21st century selves, were really never intended to be the audience of these speeches. Similarly, we can't solely judge these historical texts by the social and cultural standards of today. It's really important to understand that each of these pieces was born from a very specific and very different set of circumstances than the ones we find ourselves in now. And in order to really understand and appreciate what the speaker was trying to say, we need to really make sure that we are aware of those various contextual features. Well, context includes a lot of different things. So then how do we break down an overwhelming or potentially overwhelming task? We break it up into bits, and we use handy-dandy tools like acronyms to help us do just that. So in order to determine the rhetorical situation of any speech or text, we are going to use the acronym Soapstone. The S stands for subject, O, occasion, A, audience, P, purpose, and then the second S is the speaker. Now, the tone piece at the end, that stands for the author or the speaker's attitude. But we're going to focus mostly on the initial SOAPS portion of this acronym, and we'll take a deeper dive into the tone in lesson 3. All right, so let's make sure we understand what each of these different elements of a rhetorical situation actually is. All right, so the subject of a text is essentially the main idea, the issue, or the topic of the writing or the speech, just what it's about. The occasion is the time and place of the piece, and also the context that prompted the writing of this text. Now, all writers are influenced by the larger occasion, which includes sort of an environment of ideas and attitudes and emotions that just sort of swirl around a broad issue. All of the things sort of going on in the world that may have influenced that writer or speaker. Then there's the more immediate occasion. That's the event or situation that catches the writer's attention and triggers the response. Or perhaps it's the very moment or the location at which a speech is actually delivered. Now, both of these pieces are important to understand in determining that larger occasion piece. So we want to make sure that we're not only focusing on one or the other, but both. All right, now audience is the group or readers to whom a piece is directed. Now the specific identity of the audience will greatly influence the speaker's rhetorical strategy and choices. This is true in our own lives. When we are trying to make our own arguments, we're going to use a totally different set of tools to persuade, let's say, our older sibling to borrow the keys to their car as versus maybe grandma. Now, one must consider all of the different factors of who that audience is in order to determine what is going to be the most effective tools to use. That includes things like their mental and emotional state, past experiences that they've had, their social class, their educational level, their gender, and whether they are sympathetic or unsympathetic to the speaker's point of view. Think about what an important determining factor that is. Are they already on your side and therefore you're really just trying to drum them up and motivate them to act? Or do they believe the exact opposite of what you believe and therefore you have to help them make a total 180 to your point of view? Now, keep in mind that there may be multiple groups for which a text is directed. So as you read your text, be thinking to yourself, is the audience multifaceted? Is there more than one specific group that this is directed to? All right, now purpose refers to what the speaker or the writer hopes to achieve by writing or speaking. To determine the purpose, you want to consider the question, what does the author want his or her audience to do or believe as a result of encountering the text? Now, sometimes the purpose is explicitly stated in the speech, and sometimes it's there, but it needs to be inferred or drawn out by the reader. So keep your eyes peeled. All right, now the speaker refers to who the speaker is can hugely benefit. Who the speaker is can be hugely beneficial to understanding what and how they are trying to communicate to their audience. So we don't want to disregard who the person is that's actually writing and delivering this particular speech. Just like the audience, we want to consider the speaker's age, their gender, their cultural identity, their experiences, their political beliefs, maybe even their educational and professional expertise. We want to know all of the different things about them that may have informed what they're trying to say, the examples that they provide, the kind of credibility that they bring to this particular topic or argument just by the nature of who they are and what kind of life they have led. All right, now last but not least, tone. Tone very simply refers to the speaker or author's attitude towards the subject or their audience. Now, we have to carefully dissect different elements, including the diction, the syntax, and imagery, in order to detect the tone of a piece. It may be any type of attitude or emotion, like critical, objective, passionate, or sarcastic. It's also really important to remember that tone can shift throughout a single speech. A speaker may use multiple tones at different points in order to convey different attitudes and emotions. Alrighty, now how on earth do we collect these details? Well, there are certain elements that we can simply gather through a close reading of the text. The subject, the purpose, and the tone. As we read the text itself and really dig in and ask those critical questions and make strong observations about what the text is literally saying, we're going to be able to come to these 3 points. Now, on the other hand, occasion, audience, and speaker, we may be able to start gathering some initial details through the speech itself, but we're probably also going to have to do a little bit of internet research that goes beyond our close reading to help us gather some important historical context that we may be missing. So as you do this bit of informal research, you may want to try search terms such as the title of your speech, historical context. Right? Or perhaps you put in the name of the speaker themselves and look up any relevant details. All right, then what do we do with all of these details once we have gathered them? Well, our objective, of course, is always to understand the text on a deeper level. So we want to then re-examine the text and what the text is trying to do through the lens of its own rhetorical situation. We want to ask ourselves questions like, how did these contextual details, like when it was delivered or written and where it was delivered and who it was delivered to, how do these different elements shape the message that is being communicated? Now, the relationship between these different elements, such as the speaker and their purpose and their audience, that is something known as the rhetorical triangle. It describes the interrelationship between all of these different pieces and how each one of them contributes to the overall message. So then the big question that we want to always be asking ourselves is why? Why did the author choose this particular claim or this piece of evidence? Or why did they channel this particular tone in order to achieve his purpose or reach her audience? These are the questions that are going to take us deeper into an understanding of how the text actually functions as an argument.